welcome to the Roadman Cycling Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Mark, I was fascinated when I was researching the podcast that at the age of 15, you cycled from John O'Groats to Land's End. What has to be going on in a 15-year-old's life for that to seem like a good idea? Like, at 15 years old, I'm trying to cast my mind back. I'm pretty sure I was illegally drinking cans of beer in the local park. What possessed you to do this?
Good question. I mean, I guess for people listening to the pod in other parts of the world, John O'Groats Land's End is the length of Britain. Sort of for anyone in the UK and I guess Ireland, it's sort of the classic end-to-end route, about 1,000 miles. I guess my want to do it as a 15-year-old was a little bit of a reaction, not to start the conversation with a sob story, but a little bit of reaction to struggling at school. I was homeschooled until secondary school, so I didn't go to school. And being homeschooled and growing up on the farm gave me great independence, great wanderlust, great sense of adventure, very used to being on my own out there. But if you don't socialise until you're 12 and then you get thrown into a high school with 1,200 kids, it's a pretty rough ride. And the main sports at my school were rugby and football. And because I was quite a physical kid growing up on the farm, I was really struggling socially. I was really struggling to fit in terms of sports at school. And riding bikes and skiing and riding ponies, which were things I did on the farm, were kind of my escape. They were things I knew I was good at. So I was definitely inspired by reading about somebody who had gone from John O'Groats to Land's End. I remember picking up the local newspaper, reading the story and going, I want to do that. But I think it was also a reaction to just kind of struggling in those first years of high school, as you would if you've not socialized, if you've not integrated with society until that age. So for me, it was a bit of an expression of, well, I know I can ride my bike. Like, I'm getting a hard time because I'm terrible at everything else at school. I want to do something which, is kind of on my terms. And I'd cycled across Scotland when I was 12, and John O'Groats Land's End kind of seemed like the obvious next thing to do.
But the cultural backdrop to this, which maybe you were right to point out, US audience might be familiar with John O'Groats to Land's End, but also the cultural backdrop to cycling in Ireland and the UK. It's cool now. You see people, you just need to walk down the road, drive into any major city, and you're going to see people on Pinarellos, Factor bikes in the latest ASOS kit. It wasn't like that. Sports like football were the currency that made you cool or not cool in a school. And if you cycled, you were the furthest thing from cool. So it's even an obscure sport for a 12 to 15-year-olds to have an interest in that stage of life.
Yeah, but I think I was so far from cool, that wasn't really on my radar. I was, you're absolutely right. My main sport when I was 12, 13, 14, 15 was riding ponies. And try and go into a big city school and say that you love riding ponies. I mean, that's certainly not cool. So, yeah, I mean, I had bigger problems than whether I was, fitting in that sense. Being good at... I'm a big guy. I'm tall. I'm 90 kilos. I'm not your typical sort of pro bike rider. So the fact that I was good at adventure sports from the start, and that became very much performance record-breaking cycling, was more just being a hard farm kid than being in a club and being coached and being trained in the traditional sense. And fitting in and doing what the it kids do, I mean, that was so far from where I was at that stage in my life. I mean, I can't tell you, I've got two daughters now, age 9 and 6, and I see how they interact and how they are just amazing at, in sports and in clubs and in the friendship groups at, building that understanding of how the world works. But if you do not socialize with anyone except for your two sisters and the farm animals until you're 12 years old, it's pretty hard to catch up. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm nearly 40 years old and I'm absolutely fine. But it's pretty important to know that when I was getting on my bike and doing those first massive rides, I was doing it just because I wanted to do it. There was no infrastructure around me. There was no coach. There was no, I didn't have any grand plan. I wasn't planning to make a career out of this. I certainly didn't mean to cycle around the world twice, but I just loved doing it. I loved riding my bike, and it wasn't just the adventure of the ride. I loved planning these trips. I loved involving charities and fundraising. I enjoyed sharing my story afterwards, getting my name in the paper. I mean, the whole thing was a real buzz. If you're a kid and you're not fitting in, you then find something that you're actually quite good at and you get a bit of attention for, and you think, well, I could go further, I could do more, and the engagement outside of the actual riding the bike bit, I think, became a really important pillar of my identity as a teenager, when I wasn't necessarily, making things work in the school playground. And you can kind of see in my early 20s, 10 years on, how that experience sort of became, hey, maybe we could take this to the next level.
Were you an academic kid? I know all the way back in 1873, Jules Verne, he dreamt up this idea of kind of a Victorian Englishman who bets that he can travel the world on steamships and railways and circumnavigate it all in 80 days. Was there a romantic notion about that circumnavigation of the globe that pulled you from an early age, or was that something that came later in life as, just something that's a cool distance record?
If you'd said to me when I was 15 cycling John O'Groats Land's End, or hell, even when I was 22, 23 and I was cycling around the world the first time, if you'd said that it was possible to ride a bike around the world in less than 80 days, I'd say that's utterly, utterly impossible. There was no reference point in my history, in fact, in the history of endurance cycling, that might be possible. When I first looked at the circumnavigation world record, which is an 18,000 miles, 28,000 kilometer record. When I first looked at it, the record was 276 days. And now we're only talking about 17, 18 years ago from now. So 276, the record is now 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes. So what allows you to go 200 days faster? That's not because bikes are that much better than they were 20 years ago. Physically, we're not 200 days quicker. You've got to believe it's possible. And the first time I cycled around the world unsupported, I did so in 194 days. When I stood on the finishing line in Paris, I would have sworn to you, I would have said, that is my personal best. That is the ultimate. I cannot see how you could do that quicker. I left it all out there. And yet, 10 years later, I went over 100 days quicker. So your question about, were you inspired to live out that romantic Victorian fiction of Jules Verne and Around the World in 80 Days. I mean, I've always loved history and I've always sort of been a real student of what's gone before, but I've been on a journey since I was a 12-year-old kid, and I feel very proud that I've been a part of that generation of endurance bike riding that really have shifted the dial, genuinely shifted the dial in the last 15, 20 years. And, what we're doing now in endurance bike riding is not even in the same league as when I started. But I had no idea that this was possible when I started. It's been very pioneering by lots of people around me, and I've been trying to be a part of that generation who aren't just happy with the status quo, but are continuing to challenge, really creating these leaps in performance. And every time I've gone out to try and break a record, whether it's the length of Africa or the around the world or whatever it is, that we're not just happy with going a little bit quicker, but we're each time taking it to another level. And it's been pretty exciting to see how that's possible.
You've really been at the forefront of popularising this ultra-distance cycling. I've had a bunch of guys on the podcast. Most recently, I've had Sebastian Brewer and Lael Wilcox on. But Sebastian, in particular, he won the recent Badlands, and he's some crazy distance records as well. But I was struck by just the level of professionalism that's gone into this. And maybe it was just my naivety coming from a road background to think that ultra-endurance and bike packing didn't have this level of professionalism. But he was geeking out on rolling resistance, drivetrain efficiency, to the point of bringing his bags into the wind tunnel to optimize his coefficient of frontal drag. With that new lens, how fast do you think somebody can circumnavigate the globe? There's obviously realms of possibility here. No one's going to do it in 20 days, but how far under that 78 days can we go?
I'll be fascinated to see, when and how that record will be broken. There's practical reasons you probably couldn't break the record right now, not least because the first time I cycled around the world, I went through Iran. The second time I went around the world, I went through Russia. So there's geopolitical reasons that the actual route planning's become harder. But to your point about professionalism, I've always taken my career incredibly seriously. I think there is that stigma with endurance cycling that it's a fall out of bed and see what you can do mentality. And I've been criticized in my career for how I've done it professionally. I've made a living out of it. I've wanted a business. Even calling it a business, is sacrilegious for some people. So I've had my fair share of criticism from people who have said that that's just not the way you do it. It's meant to be about escapism and amateurism. And look, my response is very simple. there's no wrong way to ride your bike. You know, if you want to do it supported, if you want to do it unsupported, if you want to do it fast, if you want to do it slow, if you want to do it on your own, if you want to do it with friends, you know, whatever, just ride your bike. There's no wrong way to ride your bike, as long as you're honest. My only issues over the decades of doing this is people who, you know, in any way fabricate or exaggerate what they do. As long as you play it straight, if you want to do it professionally, I mean, I take my career as seriously as Andy Murray or Lewis Hamilton. You know, this has been my job for the last 20 years, to be at the forefront of ultra-endurance cycling. And, you know, I've had corporate sponsors, and I've always made television and broadcast a core principle of what I do. You know, this is not me sort of not wanting to get a proper job or whatever else other people might think about adventure cycling. I've done it because I want to take on my greatest ambitions as a bike rider and as an adventurer. I want to share it on the biggest platforms on the planet, like the BBC and GCN. And I want to do it in a way where I can hopefully share stories that give other people the quiet confidence to get out there and push themselves. They don't need to be cycling around the world. But the best feedback at all, I was at lunch in Glasgow a few hours ago, and a guy stood up from the next door table and shook my hand and said, "Mark, I read your book 10 years ago, and I then went off and cycled across Canada." And, you know, I tell you that story because it happened 2 hours ago. That is the fuel to the fire for me. That is the bit that I absolutely love. I do these things for wonderfully selfish reasons because, like any bike riders, I love where the bike can take me. I love going fast. I love going far. But as a business, when you then get to create a platform which in some ways affects and influences other people's behaviors and allows them to do things they otherwise wanted to do but maybe weren't prioritizing, that is a wonderful feedback loop. And to your point about professionalism in terms of performance, as I turn 40, I kind of wish I'd known, I guess we all say this, I wish I'd known 15 years ago what I know now. I kind of feel like I'm still learning. I'm still a student of my sport. I'm still keen each season to get better. You know, if you look at my numbers on the bike and the way I train and what I now know about nutrition and, to your point, you know, setup and aerodynamics and every aspect of psychology, you know, every aspect of how to be a better bike rider and to break these records, I'm still learning, and I absolutely love that. I think the world of ultra endurance, I mean, I guess ultra endurance 20 years ago was touring, and then road racing was over on the other end of the spectrum, and those worlds have come together. I think maybe road racing doesn't realize that, but I would still say that, you know, if you take a Pro Tour rider, say in the Tour de France, I couldn't do what they do, but I know they couldn't do what I do either. And we definitely sort of, every time I do something which is completely different, like a big gravel race or, you know, ride my penny farthing or whatever else it is, which is completely different from my sort of core discipline of ultra endurance road, I become a better bike rider because I bring back an experience which makes me think differently, train differently, recover differently, fuel differently, whatever it is. So there's a huge amount of science and an experience that goes into ultra endurance. And I guess, as I said 5-10 minutes ago, it's pretty exciting to be a part of that generation where there has been these massive leaps in performance. You asked the question before about how quick could you go around the world. I don't know the answer to that. I broke the record a few years ago by 37%. You're not going to break it by another 37%. You know, you're not going to be able to go...
To push back against that sort of creeping professionalism into bike packing and gravel cycling to probably to more of an extent, as these endeavors get increasingly professionalized, do we miss something? I'm thinking about this nebulous concept of the spirit of gravel or the spirit of adventure racing. There's something almost romantic about a story that doesn't get told, a story that happens in isolation, in a vacuum. Are we missing something as we professionalize these sports? Or are we losing a part of what made these sports great? Or is the net positive, like the guy coming up to you at the dinner table today saying, you know, I've been inspired by your story? Does that result in a net positive and offset maybe any eroding damage we are doing? Hey Roadman, excuse the short interruption. I love riding the bike, but on account of being so busy with the podcast at the moment, I'm now what's called a time crunched rider. I never thought I'd see the day. But I have a tool. I'm using Wattbike to keep myself sharp and on point with specific sessions to maximize that available training time. I have a Wattbike Atom right here in the recording studio beside me, and when I have an hour in between interviews, I jump on. It's removing all the friction points for me. There's no more 10-minute setup, unfolding legs, banging my knees off stuff, getting my hands dirty, the usual connection issues. It just works every single time. The Atom's perfect for virtual racing as well because it has crisp gear changes, it has 1% accuracy, and it has max gradient capability of up to 25%. If you're looking for an indoor trainer, I honestly couldn't recommend this any higher. I've been using a Wattbike since 2013. Honestly, it's the last indoor trainer that you're ever going to need. If you head on over to wattbike.com now and use code ROADMAN10, that's ROADMENTEN, and that's going to get you 10% off your Wattbike.
I mean, to your point, 15, 20 years ago, cycling was a niche sport. And I think now the popularity of cycling and the stories that we share and the way storytelling has become democratized through social media allows people to share their story if they want to. When I got into this game, I was telling my stories on the BBC and major network television. There was no social media. I remember going the length of the Americas, 13,000 miles, which was my second major expedition professionally, and the BBC said, would you take this thing called Twitter, which I'd never heard of now. That was, 2009? So I guess I'm lucky that my career predates that real-time storytelling, that idea of everyone can be an influencer, that idea of sort of doing things sort of semi-professionally, or professionally if you wish. So there is something very pure and there is something very wonderful about going out there and experiencing journeys on a bike for yourself, for the pure wanderlust of it. So I feel lucky that the first times I went out, I was out there maybe with a camera and it was a story that got told afterwards. But ultimately I was out there for myself. And in this day and age, things have moved beyond recognition. Everything's about real time. And that definitely gets in the way of appreciating why you're there in the first place. And I do sometimes challenge people getting into the sport saying, well, don't try and build a brand before you've actually done anything. Get out there and earn your stripes, build your experience, figure out your ability to do these things before you need credibility. You need to have that sort of... But at the heart of your question, it goes back to, I guess, what I said in the previous point. You still have the choice to ride your bike in complete anonymity, the ability to ride your bike any way that you wish. I've chosen to make bike riding my career. I've chosen to be a broadcaster, and I've absolutely loved that balance between performance and my want to try and do first and fastest, and the audience who has what I call my virtual peloton that's been a part of that journey for the last 20 years. I've loved that, and I make no apology for it. But that's not to say that everyone would enjoy it. And I'm not suggesting that everyone tries to do that. Far from it. That's been my path. So I don't think it in any way, ruins it for other people. My career sort of predates social media just. The first time I went around the world, I had a camera that I chatted to, but there was no real-time storytelling. And I often see these days the urgency and the desire to sort of brand yourself before you've actually gone out there and sort of done much and built your experience. And I guess kids these days will have that real-time storytelling from the start because it's just who they are. But if you do make the conscious decision to ride your bike more professionally, start to work with brands, then I think it's imperative that you get out there and do some interesting stuff and do it for yourself before you take on that professional responsibility, if you like. And look, like everything, everyone's allowed to have their own opinion on these things, but it's often a conversation with people where they sort of say, well, with the records that are being broken these days in ultra endurance, it's clearly been put completely out of the reach of somebody who could just fall out of bed and do these things for fun, which is kind of where I started 20 years ago. There's very few records that are that soft anymore. So it's I guess it goes back to my previous point. I would much prefer that people get to express themselves as they wish and tell their stories if they want to share them, but there's no imperative to do that. And I don't think it in any way takes away from, the grassroots, people's passion for riding bicycles, and many people's want to do it as a pure escape. But if you do decide to make it your job, then, I've also got thoughts on how you do that well and professionally and responsibly, because if you build a platform for yourself, people are going to look to you for ideas, and you got to make sure that the advice you give is credible and, what you do is positive.
What do you know now that you wish you knew at the start of your brand building storytelling journey?
I mean, on the brand side of things, I'm not sure. I mean, as on the performance side, we could talk all day about stuff I didn't know about how to train or bike fit or, set up for record breaking when I was in my early 20s. I mean, I'm thinking
more specifically towards kids who are listening to this now, and they're like, for a long period, they had only one route to quote unquote making it in cycling, and that was to get to the World Tour and get a paid salary as a World Tour rider. But trailblazers like you have made alternate routes to making it in cycling, but these routes aren't straight out performance orientated. They're routes where you also need to be a brand, where you need to be a storyteller. And I think this is the part that kids aren't that sure how to do.
No, I absolutely. And I guess the important thing to recognize is if you want to build a career as a bike rider, which is not straight racing in a traditional sense, that is a completely different skill set than actually riding your bike. I can think of quite a few people who have ridden around the planet chasing the circumnavigation world record or done other big ultra routes, and then said to me afterwards in confidence, why did that not give me the legacy? Why did that not give me the opportunities? Why did that not unlock the career that you've got? I went faster, I did this incredible thing, I rode my bike fast and far. Why have I not got a platform? And I guess my point is always, well, whilst riding around the bike, around the world is hard, or whatever that adventure challenge is, having the understanding of how to build a business, build a brand, build relationships, work with sponsors, that is a skill set that needs learnt and worked on. And I've made lots of mistakes, and I've worked incredibly hard at for the last 17, 18 years. But it's not the same thing as just riding your bike. So a lot of people think they live in a meritocracy where if you ride your bike hard and you just get a good FTP and smash out a few wins, that in and of itself will bring in the checks, bring in the profile, bring in the legacy, the opportunities. But if you want to build a platform for yourself, that is a job. That is a day job, completely separate from riding your bike. Sure, you need to back yourself up and do the things you say you're going to do, but it's not the same skill set. And, without going into too much detail, it's a lot of people ride their bike and go on bikepacking races or ultra races for the pure escape of it. And I think you have to have a conscious choice. Why am I doing this? Why do I want to do this? If you've got a perfectly good day job and this is something you do for your own passion and you're happy to share a few stories online, that's absolutely fine. If you want to professionalize it and start to monetize it and have a growth business, well, that's not given to you. That doesn't just happen. It's hard work. It's incredibly hard work. If you want to get sponsorship for what you're doing, if you want to break into media platforms, and I probably get 2 or 3 emails a week saying, I've got a great bike ride, will you introduce me to GCN? We'll make a film together. And it's just the understanding of how media works. And quite often when you're building your own interests as a bike rider, turning the telescope the other way around, and rather than seeing it from what you need, what do other people need? Why would they care? Why would people buy into what you're doing? How can you build partnerships with brands, with businesses, with media platforms that are going to sustain your ambitions as a bike rider? And what are those ideas? What is it that you're doing that's original, interesting, relatable? Trying to understand that as opposed to just, I want to go and ride my bike and win a race. That in and of itself does not make you unique.
Mark, just to finish up, talk to me about the North Coast 500, and maybe to start out, even just contextualize it for our listeners that aren't familiar with the challenge.
Thanks for asking, because it's kind of fresh. The North Coast 500 is a classic touring route around the north coast of Scotland, 500 miles, so just over 800 kilometres. Starts from Inverness Castle, and I set the record on it back in 2015, and it had been broken a whole number of times since. It was broken last year by Robbie Mitchell, who at the time was the national 24-hour time trial champion. So it was sitting at 29 hours and 6 minutes, which is pretty punchy for a 500-mile route, 10,000 meters of climbing. It's a very, very hilly route. So I set out last month to try and better that. And I knew on paper I could do it. I knew how you could do it if you had the right weather conditions, but I knew it would also be the hardest single effort ride of my life. You know, let's not compare this to a multi-week, multi-month ride, but you know, in terms of getting on the bike, I ended up having a normalized power of 261 watts for 28 hours and 35 minutes. And so I was off the bike for 16 minutes in 28 and a half hours. So to ride consistently at that level, and I mean, anyone who understands riding a bike, you know, that's not a jog. That's an effort. That's a level where you really do need to be thinking about it. So to do it for an hour is fair enough, 2 hours fair enough, 5 hours, but through terrain, through the night, non-stop for 28 and a half hours, I'd never done that. And ended up taking half an hour off the record. But only through riding very, very consistently. I caught up with Robbie in terms of his record time at mile 350 out of 500. So if you look at the graphs of our performance, you know, he had an incredible ride, but what I was really proud of was that ability to ride at the same power and consistency throughout, so that, you know, as his effort sort of leveled off in the final third, you know, I caught and then put half an hour into his time. And he sent me a lovely message the day afterwards. And he said, look, Mark, nobody, not even your closest team, will understand, you know, what you went through to do that, but I do. And I thought that was incredibly sweet and humble, and, you know, a lovely, lovely guy. And I think that's, you know, that epitomizes ultra endurance racing. Yeah, I'm in the game of trying to break records, but, you know, I love when people try and indeed do break mine. And, you know, I'm just excited to be a part of that generation where, you know, we're still trying to figure out physically, psychologically, you know, in terms of technology and the bikes as well, you know, what's possible.
Mark, you've been largely responsible for defining this category, and now pushing forward, you're responsible for reshaping this category. Just keep doing what you're doing, and thanks for joining me on the Roadman Cycling Podcast.
Absolute pleasure.
So if you like this video, you should definitely check out this video, because I know you're going to love it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel.